situation. I've suggested that the prefrontal areas now for the first time are coming online.
Babies are born with a powerful instinct that motivates them to elicit as much care and attention as possible from their caregivers. Babies and toddlers then learn by experience the best way to form relationships with each individual caregiver. Babies can only form a very few close attachment relationships, and to do this it's essential for them to have continuous relationships with permanent caregivers. The baby will develop a special lasting bond to one of those permanent caregivers, who becomes their primary attachment figure, usually but not necessarily the biological mother. But the other attachment figures, including father, remain vital for the child's well-being.
The growth spurt of the brain is occurring from the last trimester of infancy through the second year. And at that time, the brain is more than doubling in size. It's connecting up. But its maturation is experience dependent. It's not as if the genes are encoding how everything is going to fall together. It needs certain types of experiences for the brain to grow. And the most important parts of the brain that we're looking at in the first year to grow by my own thoughts are those parts of the brain that are involved with the emotional and the social functioning of the child. Those are the ones which are embedded in the attachment relationship. In order for those parts of the brain to grow, which is part of the limbic system involved with emotion, certain experiences are needed. Those experiences are embedded in the relationship between the caregiver and the infant. If they're positive, if they're regulated, then we'll have an optimal situation, and literally the potentiality of the genes will be carried forth to the fullest, so to speak. And so now one of the most important recent discoveries in the last 10 years in biology has been this idea about developmental cell death. The brain does not continue to grow and grow and grow. It organizes, then it disorganizes, then it reorganizes. And the disorganization of the brain, which is the massive death of billions of neurons and the disconnections of synapses, is part of how the brain is growing as it's reorganizing. Those connections that are not used die off, which is why early enriched environments, which means emotionally and early enriched environments, more so than wonderful little dangling colors and shapes, are key here. As if to say there's something necessary that the human brain needs in terms of other human contact for it to grow. It's a use it or lose it situation. Cells that fire together, wire together. Cells that do not die together.
All babies are individuals, and they modify their nurture-seeking strategy to cope with the emotional capabilities of their particular caregivers. Not all caregivers will be able to provide sufficiently responsive and sensitive care for the baby to form a secure attachment. Under these circumstances, the baby may use an indirect approach to its caregiver in order to elicit as much comfort and attention as the caregiver can manage to give. And an insecure attachment relationship may become established. This is the period when the brain is undergoing major structural development, and the connections the brain cells are making at this time will influence the pattern for making new relationships in the future. There's a strong tendency for the quality of the relationship with the primary attachment figure to become the dominant and long-lasting internal working model of relationships as the child grows up. Alan Shaw uses co-regulate to describe the emotional and neurochemical effects that the mother and child have on one another.
The genetic systems that are encoding the connections of the highest parts of the brain that are involved in social and emotional functions, which are literally the hierarchical apex of the limbic system, are spinning out at 10, 12 months. Those genes are being affected by the hormones that are being stimulated in the relationship between the mother and the infant. Because when the mother and the infant are in a dyadic dance, when they're attuned to each other, the work of Hofer is now showing that literally their psychobiological systems are co-regulating each other. And that, for example, Their opiate systems, their endorphin systems are now mutually regulating each other. Well, we know for a fact that the endorphin systems regulate genes positively. We also know that cortisol, which is the stress hormone, also directly regulates genes. What I'm saying by this is that the attachment relationship is directly regulating the genome. It's directly regulating the way that the genes are going to encode the proteins, etc. This goes far from the idea about what is nature and what is nurture. They're coming together, and it's been said that literally the first gene-environment interactions are found in the psychobiological interaction between the mother and the infant.
One thing that usually happens in a child's early experience is they develop a sense of connection with other people. By caring about our infants and children, we not only teach them to accept care, we give them the experience of and the sense of being fundamentally connected with other people. It's this connection that underlies empathy and fundamentally underlies the control of aggression.
If the carer is able to respond to a baby's cues for attention with sensitivity that's neither too slow and neglectful, nor too abrupt and controlling, but appropriate and predictable, the baby will start to develop a confident and trusting relationship. There are no hard and fast rules to this behaviour, but if the carer is in tune in this way, the baby develops a sense of secure attachment and high self-esteem.
In fact, it's probably rarely examined. I don't think children with high self-esteem think as they start their day, well, I'm secure, things will work out for me today probably. It doesn't have to be examined. It goes without saying. It's a certainty. It's part of them. What I mean by that is it comes from inside. It's an abiding belief that things will work out for you.
A carer who can see the baby as a real person and is responsive to the baby's attempts to communicate will give the baby an opportunity to have a straightforward and confident relationship. The baby then has a positive model of how another person feels towards them, essential for forming long-lasting friendships.
The right hemisphere ultimately becomes dominant in the humans for social functions, for emotional functions, for the processing of social emotional information. It also becomes dominant for empathy, for the ability to empathically understand the states of other human beings, to be able to read their intentions. This is done at levels, at unconscious levels. This is done at intuitive levels.
The main support we have for controlling our aggression is the fact that we can empathize with the other person. Injuring another person, we're prone to rather feeling ourselves. We recognize what that other person is feeling, and normally we can feel their pain. And therefore, when we give pain to another person, it's uncomfortable to us ourselves.
What the attachment relationship is a combination of the psychobiological predisposition of a particular infant, which is genetically encoded, and the interactive experiences that the child has with the caregiver.
The most significant predictor for a child to become securely attached is for the child to have an attachment figure who has a realistic and coherent insight into how their own childhood relationships worked with their attachment figures. In other words, for the child to have a securely attached caregiver. Attachment behavior helps to provide a safe environment for a baby to be adventurous and explore the exciting and unfamiliar world. A caregiver that shares the baby's joy and excitement in exploration actively stimulates brain growth.
Most of the studies that have come out of animals have focused on anxiety as being the key affect. The problem is that with human beings in the first year of life, joy is much more the key to the attachment. By joining with the child in making this dyadic system, what they are doing is they are interactively co-regulating very high levels of positive emotion. So essentially what the attachment relationship is, an interactive mechanism for generating very high levels of positive affect. And the positive affect, this goes to the work of Tompkins, etc., is enjoyment, joy, and interest, excitement.
They first do tickling under the arms, on the belly, little do the legs back and forth games, and it is a magical moment when that first smile and laugh happens. But that moment, although it's magical, it's the start of a very interesting reciprocal interaction that continues throughout life.
So we are pre-programmed with a mechanism for laughing with others. Tickling produces laughter, and both have evolved to allow us to relate to those around us. And out of tickling and laughter develops the most social behavior of all, play.
And I don't know if you'll ever get loose.
It's the amplification of positive states that really allows for growth, because we now know that dopamine actually is trophic. It allows neurons to grow, and it allows synapses to bind together.
Males often provide high levels of excitement and stimulation for a child, which secretes dopamine, the big buzz reward hormone, and may use similar behavior in an attempt to distract a fractious child. Females often take the role of providing a refuge or secure base that gives the infant reassurance, confidence, and security.
The interaction between a mother and an infant, clearly what we're seeing are interactions of mind-body and mind-body.
You're such a good dancer.
Because as they're dancing together, both the bodily systems, which are co-regulating, are also being activated. They're linked together by their autonomic nervous system, which is in the body, etc.
Routine social experiences, whether happy and satisfying or sad and frightening, will start to form a network of connections between brain cells. If these connections are reinforced on a regular and predictable basis, they'll form stable structures in the appropriate part of the brain that can last for the person's lifetime, for better or worse.
Especially if you see a child that's chronically shows deviant behavior, that is mean to other children and takes delight in being mean to other children, is defiant of the teachers. Uniformly, these children have had troubled histories. This doesn't just spring up from nowhere.
But if there are negative impacts this early on this early developing fragile system, because the growth of the brain itself will be altered, there are going to be negative, long-term negative situations, which is the equivalent of long-term insecure attachments. The difference now being that the insecure attachments have unique aspects of brain physiology to each of them.
Researchers have found that neglect is amongst the most painful of childhood traumas. It seems that to feel alone and have no one pay attention or show an interest contributes to low self-esteem, which underlies many long-term emotional problems.
If the child's experience is that no matter what they do, they cannot get a response from the caregiving environment, it's easy for them to generalize that attitude more broadly and begin to believe, I simply can't ever make things happen. And one of the key features of depression is a sense of helplessness and hopelessness.
The security of the attachment is a function of the mother being able to be a regulator for the child, that in the moments of insecurity, the child will come back to the mother, and the mother then can regulate down negative states. So that if the child now is anxious or insecure, goes out into the world and is feeling anxiety, etc., the mother now becomes a regulator of the anxiety. And for him, he's saying that that is a central part of the bond, which is the regulation of negative states. And self-regulation, incidentally, essentially, for me, is the capacity to auto-regulate or to interactively regulate, to shift back and forth between connectedness and autonomy whenever it's adaptive to do so.
Researchers have found a curious paradox. It's that the warmth of a caregiver by itself does not lead to a baby becoming securely attached to them. Warmth is the most obvious caregiving quality that observers look for, and it's often confused with sensitivity, which is a good predictor of forming a secure attachment. Observers describe warmth as the caregiver holding the baby easily, seeming to enjoy contact with him, and treating him with apparent affection. However, if the warmth does not match the mood of the baby, or is inconsistent and insensitive, the baby is less able to develop the predictable and confident relationship that they need. Babies need to feel confident and secure that both their emotional and physical needs will be met if they are to become resilient and independent adults who have the strength to overcome adversity.
There's a very popular term these days, which is resilience. This is the idea that some children can do well even though they're facing difficulty. Well, it turns out, of course, that the capacity for resilience doesn't just spring up out of nowhere either. Children who can do well in the face of adversity have been prepared for that by having a strong foundation so that they have a basis for believing that they will prevail, because they've been supported and encouraged and helped to prevail repeatedly in the past.
Coping with the changes in the emotional and physical needs of a child as they progress from being a young baby through becoming a toddler to being a child takes a lot of time and energy and requires an ever-broadening range of parenting skills. The child's self-control develops with the gradual introduction of appropriate guidance, not so early that the child's emerging personality is crushed, nor so late that the lack of supervision leaves them neglected and unsociable.
The capacity to experience emotional states, more and more intense emotional states, and a broader range of emotional states, is the outcome of a secure attachment. What you're getting is what's called an expansion of the affect array. The mother is able to tune into both negative and positive states, and as a result of that, the child now learns that these states exist within the self and that these states are shareable with other human beings.
This is one of the more interesting paradoxes, that self-reliance comes out of social relatedness. And it's a strong finding. In our research, we predict differences in dependency all the way into adolescence from these infant assessments. And it is the infants who were anxiously attached, including those whose parents were not responsive to their bids for contact and reassurance, who later have the dependency problems. Of course you can spoil a child at some point. And of course it's important for parents to let children do what they can do. If you do too much for them, they're handicapped. But you can't spoil a young baby. And it's important for children to always feel supported by you if you want them to be independent.
Toddlers learn what's acceptable behavior by copying the example of the people around them and from being guided and supported by their carers. Toddlers will accept all regularly repeated experiences as being the norm and use them to build their internal working model of how to behave towards other people in the future. An all too common example of a detrimental effect on the developing brain of a baby is stress, the modern scourge of our daily lives.
From the cradle to the grave, we're living a pace of life that is out of kilter with our hormones, and this has an impact at every stage of our development.
The fact that stress early on in life, even before you're born or in very early childhood has a major effect on you is something that we've really only realized within the last few years. When the child is in the womb, practically all of its sensory information comes through its umbilical cord from its mother in chemical messages. So what the child is seeing is the stress that its mother is seeing. She is producing hormones, particularly cortisol in the blood, and that will be going across the placenta into the baby. So early on in life, we've programmed the whole of their hormonal system so that for the rest of their lives, they're more responsive to stress.
Raised levels of cortisol in a baby can result from long-term maternal depression, rejection or neglect of the baby, harsh treatment of the baby, a climate of violence in the family, and other unpredictable or chaotic domestic situations.
So when a child is very disruptive at school, frequently getting into fights, being defiant of the teachers, being truant, and this range of school problems that are so common, one has to start with the belief that there is an explanation, and that the most likely explanation doesn't have to do with the inherent nature of this child. Children aren't born to be delinquent. They aren't born to be disruptive in school. They've come to be.
When a baby experiences regular high levels of stress, the brainstem triggers the production of high levels of cortisol. If stress continues, the brainstem becomes enlarged and triggers even higher levels of cortisol, making the baby overreact to even mild stress, and setting it on the path to hyperactivity and later behavior problems.
If a child hasn't had the opportunity to develop this basic sense of connection with others, they're much less likely to have this deep sense of empathy. And therefore, they're not well protected against the feelings of aggression. So I think it's both things. I think that children's aggressive and disruptive behavior at school is both because of a sense of alienation with regard to other people, and it's because of feelings of anger and resentment for not having their own needs met.
The instinctive stress responses, which are controlled by the brainstem, are to flee from a dangerous situation, to face it and fight, or to freeze. Babies are too small to fight or flee, so under repeated situations of neglect or abuse, they'll sometimes freeze rather than risk more abuse by seeking comfort.
The major coping mechanisms of the brain are found in the right. The major ways in which we cope with stress are unconscious mechanisms in the right, and these again are a function of the attachment relationship.
The earliest comfort that babies get is from sucking. This action releases soothing endorphins in the baby's brain.
If one has been regulated, if one has been comforted, then one learns how to auto-regulate and auto-comfort.
Child behavior researchers have known for many years that experiences in the first 3 years have a powerful influence on later life. Professor Shaw gives the neuropsychologist view on this sensitive period.
During a critical period, a portion of the brain is growing at that time. And if you looked in the brain, what you would see is a massive overproliferation of synapses in that area. Now, the synapses are encoded by the genes, but the experience pares them back down. So now you have, again, a gene-environment interaction.
A dramatic illustration of the effects that early traumatic childhood experiences can have on a developing brain comes from the awful example of children raised in Romanian orphanages. Some of these infants suffered appalling neglect of both human company and physical need to a degree that's far removed from any normal childhood experience.
What it also means is that in an extremely poor situation whereby the brain was not used, or that portion of the brain was not used, essentially what you'll get is massive cell death. he said that when you looked at the left hemisphere of this boy, what you're finding is that the areas that are involved in speech are underdeveloped, and the metabolism in those areas is very low. The speech areas, Broca's areas, etc. But then he said something that I thought was chilling. What he said was, the areas on the right, which are on the other side, are a black hole. In other words, there is nothing there. These are the areas that are involved with emotional functions, especially the areas in the cortex that are connecting up with the subcortex, which are involved with emotional and somatic aspects of behavior.
These scans make powerful illustrations. They show a healthy child's brain on the left, with normal activity in the temporal lobes, and a neglected orphan's brain of a similar age on the right, where the temporal lobes are nearly empty. The temporal lobes are known to regulate emotions. They show how temporal lobe formation is greatly retarded by the limited emotional experiences of this infant during the sensitive early years of brain development.
Now, this does not mean all abused brains are going to be in this kind of a situation, and I don't mean to see that all plasticity is gone. However, the amount of plasticity that's left, the amount of the capacity that is left, depends again on the attachment.
And it just doesn't happen that a child suddenly becomes defiant, mean-spirited, and hostile towards others with no reason. Either there's been an ongoing foundation in the child's history, or exceedingly difficult circumstances have been presented to that child. We just don't see it. We just don't see these things arise out of nowhere.
Research evidence shows how a childhood made painful by abuse and neglect often leads to later violent behavior, and how traumatic childhood memories re-emerge in parenthood and may continue the cycle into the next generation. Thank goodness the cycle can be broken, and not everyone who's been abused goes on to become abusive. However, for those people whose problems have not been resolved, life is much less satisfying.
Violence and antisocial behavior is one of the easiest things to predict from a knowledge of the child's history. The conditions are well known that produce violence. They include things like chronic rejection of the child, physical abuse of the child, a climate of violence in the family, lack of supervision of the child, a form of neglect, basically, chaotic home situation, lots of stress, lots of instability, lots of uncertainty in the situation. That combination of experiences produces aggressive children quite routinely.
The human pattern of infant nurturing is a blend of genetically inherited instincts on the one hand and learned strategies on the other. The inherited instincts are based on the lifestyle in which humans evolved many thousands of years ago, and the learned strategies are adapted to the culture of the parents now in the 21st century.
The babies are always in close contact with someone. They are never exiled to cribs or cradles. They're free to hug, to cling. We can only speculate about how different kinds of caring affect us. One thing we do know, it all starts with a loving adult.
Not much room. Will you see if you can put them all in that drawer for me?
We don't
Okay.
actually spend time communicating through touch. It's
Okay.
lost to us. And what we really do need to do is take time out to begin to restore some of that in our lives.
At times of danger, attachment behaviour has a powerful survival value by the instinctive behaviour of the child staying close by and the mother encouraging this. At times of safety and confidence, the child uses its attachment figure as a secure base from which to go out and explore the world. All babies and small children are instinctively motivated to form as